The aluminum tariffs Trump rolled out are backfiring in ways no one anticipated. And Canada's producers have found a remarkably forceful counterpunch. Instead of being crushed, as Trump initially intended when he slapped a punitive 25% duty directly on Quebec's aluminum industry, the opposite scenario has unfolded. Quebec's corporations are not only thriving, but have seized the opportunity to flood European markets, proving that economic coercion can trigger consequences far beyond what was expected. The latest figures expose the failure of Trump's protectionist strategy. Quebec, responsible for 90% of Canada's total aluminum output, pivoted its exports almost overnight. In the first quarter, nearly all of Quebec's aluminum, 95%, went to the United States. Yet just 1 quarter later, the share dropped to 78%. Over the same period, Europe's market share, previously negligible at just 0.2%, soared to 18%. In other words, market penetration skyrocketed by 9,000% in a matter of months. Clearly, what we are seeing reveals Trump's fundamental misunderstanding of how global trade operates. A movement to squeeze Canada has instead given Quebec's smelters the push to expand into new markets, diversify their customers, and reduce dependence on the U.S. This is a textbook example that in international trade, throwing up barriers doesn't necessarily force opponents to yield. In fact, it can sometimes propel them to grow stronger. This is no longer about minor adjustments in export flows. What's unfolding is a wholesale restructuring of North America's aluminum supply chain, an ecosystem that took decades to build. Industry giants like Rio Tinto, Alcoa, and Aluminary Alouette, the pillars of Quebec's aluminum sector, have been forced to rethink their strategies from the ground up, all because of Washington's risky trade decisions. The disruption is evident in the numbers. Alcoa, for example, diverted around 100,000 tons of aluminum away from the U.S. market to Europe and other destinations. That volume alone is enough to produce millions of cars or mountains of beverage cans, products that would normally sustain U.S. manufacturing jobs and help keep prices steady. But the most dramatic pivot came from Alouette, the continent's largest smelter. There, with Rio Tinto holding a 40% stake, fully 57% of its second quarter output was shipped to Europe. That figure dwarfs the 4% share in the first quarter, representing a colossal increase of more than 1,500% from just one facility. It's a clear illustration of the speed and scale of this shift. John Simard, president of the Aluminium Association of Canada, put it bluntly to reporters in Montreal. It's very simple. Any shipment that can be sent to Europe will be sent. For Canadian producers, Europe has now become an economic shield against a faltering U.S. market. Put another way, Trump's tariffs have made selling into the U.S. unworkable, and a policy designed to protect domestic manufacturing is instead turning the U.S. into the toughest customer to serve. It sounds unbelievable, but it is true. Trump justified his aluminum tariffs on the grounds of protecting national security and reviving domestic manufacturing. Yet, the outcome has been the exact opposite. Aluminum prices in the United States have surged well above international levels, eroding the competitiveness of American businesses, while their closest and most reliable partner, Canada, has turned away in search of more profitable markets. One clear example is the so-called Midwest Premium, the extra charge American consumers pay on top of the global benchmark price. Since early June, when Trump raised aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50%, this premium has jumped by 82%. That means U.S. manufacturers are now saddled with unreasonably high costs, while Canadian suppliers have easily pivoted to sell into more attractive markets. The irony is that Europeans have become the biggest beneficiaries of this trade war. The figures in Rotterdam tell the story. The local premium calculated against the London Metal Exchange price has dropped from 14.3% at the start of the year to just 9.1% last week. European producers have been quick to seize the opportunity, buying cheaper aluminium that Canada redirected their way. This gives them a clear competitive edge over American firms. A global trading system that had functioned steadily for decades is now being shaken apart by a handful of hasty political decisions. What is happening is not simply a temporary disruption, but rather a sign of a fundamental shift in how global commerce operates with consequences that could last for years. Jason Kaplan, a non-ferrous metals analyst at S&P Global, posed the crucial question: is this just a short-term shock or a genuine structural change? Increasingly, the data points to a long-term reordering. The evidence shows Europe is fully capable of absorbing Canada's massive aluminium volumes, while Canadian firms have demonstrated they can pivot away from their traditional U.S. customers and secure new outlets. Once these trade links are forged and supply chains redesigned, they will not be easily reversed, even if Washington dismantles its tariff walls. That is because the costs of building relationships, maintaining contracts, and fostering trust in international commerce far outweigh any short-lived political adjustments. This aluminium war also exposes Trump's basic misunderstanding of North America's economic interdependence. Quebec's aluminium sector was built to serve the U.S. market directly, drawing on its proximity to the border, abundant hydroelectric power, and seamless cross-border transport networks. The province's large-scale smelters exist first and foremost to supply American manufacturers. Yet, Trump's tariffs have distorted this natural relationship, creating artificial inefficiencies and higher costs. Canadian aluminium, instead of traveling just a few hundred kilometers to U.S. auto plants, or can manufacturers must now cross thousands of miles over the Atlantic. It is a waste, both economically and logistically, hurting Canada and the United States alike, while eroding decades of continental integration. The human toll of this trade shock is now plain to see, far more painful than any chart or report could convey. In Quebec, many businesses were forced to cut jobs even before Trump's tariffs officially took effect. South Shore, a furniture manufacturer, laid off 115 workers because 70% of its revenue depended on the U.S. market, which had already slumped sharply after Trump threatened tariffs. In Laval, Uniboard had to temporarily shut down 5 production lines. Meanwhile, Shearex was compelled to let go of 40% of its staff for a simple reason. 85% of its exports went to the U.S., and those shipments were no longer guaranteed once the new tariff policy was announced. These are not abstract figures. They represent hundreds of families losing their livelihoods because of a reckless political decision. The paradox is that job losses are also occurring in the United States itself, as companies face higher input costs and steadily lose their competitive edge on the global market. The aluminium industry is especially vulnerable given its massive capital requirements and long-term outlook. No one can build a smelter in a matter of months to adapt to new policy. Once Canada is forced to pivot toward alternative markets and establish new partnerships, those relationships will become a durable part of the global trading map, not a temporary detour. The reality Trump seems to ignore is that the U.S. produces very little primary aluminium relative to its consumption. Data from the Aluminium Association of Canada shows that the U.S.'s maximum annual output is about 1 million tons, while demand is 6 times higher. This enormous gap has long been filled by Canadian aluminium, a source that is both nearby and reliable. By artificially inflating the price of Canadian metal through tariffs, Trump's policy has done nothing to boost domestic output. All it has achieved is to force U.S. companies to pay more for the same product, or worse, to rely on distant, less stable, and less trustworthy suppliers. While the U.S. market has grown unstable under the weight of tariffs, Canadian firms have wasted no time in finding new destinations, places free of irrational barriers and eager to receive their high-quality aluminium. Instead of responding with fiery rhetoric, Ottawa has chosen a more measured path, implementing practical support measures and focusing on diversifying markets. The federal government has rolled out a range of programs, from national infrastructure projects and direct funding for impacted companies to initiatives that help businesses expand exports beyond the United States. No one has benefited more than Europe. Producers there now have access to Canadian aluminium of high quality at more competitive prices, giving them a decisive advantage over their U.S. rivals. In essence, this represents a transfer of economic benefit from North America to Europe, an outcome directly created by Trump's flawed policy. European officials have quickly seized the moment, deepening dialogue with Canadian companies and treating this as a lever to strengthen their own industrial position while the U.S. squanders its edge. What is even more worrying are the long-term strategic consequences. North America's aluminum industry has long relied on deep integration. Canada produces, the United States consumes, a model that is both efficient and cost-effective. But Trump's tariffs are breaking this bond, putting the competitiveness of the entire region at risk on the global stage. Canadian giants such as Rio Tinto and Alcoa are now investing heavily in logistics networks, warehousing, and customer service infrastructure in Europe. Once these new linkages are established, they will not simply vanish, even if the U.S. eventually removes its tariffs. In other words, instead of pulling the aluminum supply chain back to the United States, Trump's policy has inadvertently pushed Canada to seek out and commit to new partners across the Atlantic. This is the clearest example of tariffs not only backfiring but also driving lasting change, changes that run directly counter to the original goal. Rather than bringing production back to the U.S. as promised, Trump's tariffs have unintentionally encouraged America's most reliable suppliers to expand into new markets. Instead of strengthening domestic industry, the policy has left U.S. companies struggling as their input costs climb. According to data from S&P Global Market Intelligence, this is not a minor adjustment, but a profound restructuring of North America's trade architecture. In just one quarter, Quebec's aluminum exports to the U.S. plunged from 95% to 78%, while shipments to Europe surged by 9,000%. This reversal signals a systemic shift, not a short-term fluctuation. Aluminium is not only used to make beer and soft drink cans, but is also a strategic input for automobiles, aerospace, construction, and defense. When the aluminium supply chain is blocked by tariffs, the shock ripples across the entire economy, driving up car prices, infrastructure costs, and more. The irony is that the American auto sector, the very industry Trump often claimed to be protecting, has been directly hit, paying higher prices and facing supply risks. Meanwhile, European automakers are reaping the benefits, accessing Canadian aluminium at lower costs and consolidating their competitive edge. The paradox is stark. A policy Trump defended in the name of national security is in reality undermining America's supply chain security. By pushing Canada, its closest ally and most stable supplier, out of the equation, the U.S. has not become safer. On the contrary, it has grown more vulnerable. Canadian aluminium companies have proven they can successfully pivot to other markets, reducing their reliance on the U.S. in any future supply crisis. Gene Samar once remarked that when aluminium prices in the U.S. rise high enough, Canadian metal might eventually flow back south. But by then, the new trade relationships in Europe will already be firmly established, and the trust that once underpinned North American integration will be far harder to restore. Quebec's success in carving out a foothold in Europe also highlights the global nature of today's commodity trade. These are not small businesses, but multinational corporations with the capital, capacity, and agility to serve markets worldwide. Once the U.S. chooses to erect barriers, they still have many other paths to survive and grow. The Aluminium War is a textbook example of the unintended consequences of protectionism. Rather than shielding domestic industry and creating jobs, Trump's policy has weakened American companies, handed advantages to European competitors, and proven that Canada can thrive outside its reliance on the U.S. The erosion of trust in the bilateral trade relationship could last for years, perhaps even decades after the tariffs are lifted. In international commerce, reliability and stability are the foundation. Once America shows it is willing to impose punitive measures even on its closest ally, its image as a trustworthy partner is severely undermined. The end result is that Trump's tariffs have not only backfired, but have also left a lasting fracture in the global trade model that North America once led.